You think I want this? Anthony's voice was a lethal, vibrating whisper. His dark eyes, entirely devoid of warmth, locked onto hers as he slammed the heavy, gold-embossed contract onto the sticky diner table. You're a waitress drowning in debt. I run the largest underground syndicate in this city. This marriage is a cage for both of us. Forced by a dead man's promise, Hazel wiped her trembling, grease-stained hands on her apron, staring in absolute horror at the terrifying man and the staggering zeros on the bank check he offered. I won't be your pawn, she choked out. Anthony leaned in, the scent of expensive cologne and cold steel washing over her. You don't have a choice. Marry me, or lose everything. The neon sign outside Pete's diner buzzed with a frantic, dying rhythm, casting harsh, intermittent slashes of crimson light across the cracked linoleum floor. It was 2:14 a.m. on a relentless, rain-swept Tuesday. Hazel stood behind the scarred Formica counter, a damp, graying rag moving in slow, mindless circles over a coffee stain that had set in hours ago. Her feet, encased in cheap, worn-out sneakers, throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache that radiated up her calves. This was her third double shift in 5 days, a desperate attempt to outrun the crushing weight of her reality. Burning a hole in the pocket of her faded jeans was a final notice from the Street Jude Care Facility. $4,000 by Friday, or her mother would be transferred to an underfunded state ward. It was a sum that might as well have been $4 million. The rusted bell above the diner's glass door chimed, shattering the fragile, exhausted silence. It wasn't the soft, hesitant jingle of a weary late-night trucker. The door was pushed open with deliberate, aggressive force. 3 men stepped into the harsh, fluorescent light, bringing the cold, wet night in with them. 2 of them were built like concrete bunkers, their eyes scanning the empty booths with a chilling, professional paranoia. But it was the man in the center who instantly commanded the oxygen in the room. He moved with the fluid, silent grace of an apex predator. His bespoke charcoal suit looked entirely alien against the backdrop of peeling vinyl booths and cheap ketchup dispensers. Raindrops gleamed like scattered diamonds in his impeccably styled dark hair. When his gaze locked onto Hazel, she felt the breath physically leave her lungs. His obsidian eyes were ancient, cold, and entirely merciless. He dissected her in a fraction of a second, taking in her stained apron, the dark, bruised circles beneath her eyes, and the slight, involuntary tremble in her hands. Hazel, he said. It wasn't a question. The way her name rolled off his tongue sounded like a verdict. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that vibrated against the stacked coffee mugs on the shelves. She swallowed hard, her throat dry as dust, instinctively pressing her spine against the stainless steel of the pie display case. "We're closed," she managed to say, her voice cracking. "The grill is off. Just coffee." He didn't blink. He walked slowly toward the counter, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the wet linoleum. "I'm not here for coffee." He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. Hazel flinched, her mind instantly conjuring images of firearms. Instead, he withdrew a thick, cream-colored envelope and a heavy silver fountain pen, laying them on the counter with a deliberate, echoing thud. "My name is Anthony. You are going to sign the document inside this envelope." Panic, sharp and metallic, tasted like copper in her mouth. "I don't know you. I don't sign things from strangers. You need to leave before I call the police." A humorless, razor-thin smile touched the corner of Anthony's mouth. "The police do not concern me. What should concern you is the eviction notice on your mother's house and the final billing warning from the care facility." Hazel's blood ran completely cold. The diner seemed to violently tilt on its axis. "How do you know about that? Who are you?" "I am the man who holds the debt of your late father," Anthony stated flatly, devoid of any inflection. 20 years ago, your father saved the life of my predecessor, In return, a blood oath was sworn to protect his bloodline. The old man died 2 days ago. To solidify my ascension to power within the syndicate, and to appease the traditionalists who value archaic promises, I must honor this debt absolutely. Hazel shook her head, her mind rejecting the words. Syndicate? A blood oath? My father was a mechanic who died of a heart attack. You have the wrong person. I never have the wrong person, Anthony replied smoothly, tapping the envelope. A mechanic was merely his daytime disguise. Now, the old man's dying wish has tied my hands. I must bring you under my absolute protection. By doing what? Hazel whispered, cold dread pooling in her stomach. Anthony's jaw tightened. For a brief second, a flicker of genuine irritation crossed his sculpted features. By marrying me tomorrow. The sheer absurdity of the statement hung heavily in the stale air. You're insane, Hazel choked out, a breathless sound that was half laugh, half sob. I'm not marrying a stranger. I'm not marrying a mobster. Get out. Anthony didn't move. He simply slid the envelope closer to her trembling hands. Inside is a legally binding marriage contract and a cashier's check for $500,000. Sign the paper, Hazel. Your mother gets the best medical care in the world. Her house is paid off. You never work another grueling shift in this grease trap again. He leaned forward, bracing his hands on the counter until she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes. Refuse, and you face the reality of your world alone. The bank forecloses. Your mother is turned out. And I walk away, my obligation legally and morally severed by your refusal. Hazel stared at the envelope. $500,000. It was a mythical sum. It was life. It was her mother breathing easy. She looked back up at Anthony, seeing the utter, terrifying ruthlessness in his posture. He wasn't asking. He was presenting a trap beautifully disguised as a lifeline. Tears of furious despair pricked her eyes. This isn't a marriage. She trembled, her voice laced with both anger and defeat. It's a purchase. It is a business transaction, Anthony corrected coldly, stepping back and gesturing to the pen. Nothing more. Sign it. The heavily armored SUV glided through the towering wrought-iron gates of Anthony's estate, revealing a sprawling, cold grey stone mansion that looked more like a fortress. Hazel sat rigidly in the back seat, her worn clothes glaringly out of place against the cream leather. She hadn't slept since signing the papers that secured her mother's care, a nauseating reminder of the immense, dangerous power she had just bound herself to. Anthony was waiting in the cavernous, marble-floored grand foyer. He looked up from a tablet, his expression entirely unreadable. You arrived on schedule, he stated flatly. I didn't exactly have other plans, Hazel replied, wrapping her arms around her torso, feeling incredibly small. Where do I go? What am I supposed to do here? Anthony walked toward her, his footsteps echoing. You are expected to exist, Hazel. Nothing more. This marriage is an optics play for my syndicate. In the eyes of the city, you are my wife. In these walls, you are a ghost. Your quarters are in the East Wing. Your mother's medical bills are handled permanently. Hazel stared at his clinical detachment. And what do you get out of this? Compliance. Peace within my ranks. Anthony answered instantly, his dark eyes boring into hers. You do not ask questions about my business. You do not enter my study. When we appear in public, you play the devoted wife. Here, we live separate lives. Do we understand each other? Perfectly, Hazel snapped, her chin lifting defiantly. I stay in my cage. You run your empire. Once my mother is safe, I don't care what you do. Anthony gave a curt nod. Good. A designer will arrive at noon. Your current attire is unacceptable. Before she could retort, he turned and strode away. A silent housekeeper soon led Hazel up the sweeping staircase to her new suite. It was vast, dripping in muted golds and luxury. Yet the moment the heavy door clicked shut, locking her inside, the reality crashed over her. She was surrounded by millions of dollars of wealth, yet she had never felt so utterly, profoundly impoverished. Sinking onto the edge of the incredibly soft mattress, Hazel buried her face in her hands and finally wept. 3 weeks into her gilded captivity, the fragile truce was shattered by a formalized note. Tonight, 8 p.m., the Belvedere Room, black tie. By 7:30 p.m., Hazel stood before her mirror, barely recognizing the woman in the midnight blue silk gown. When Anthony arrived at her door in a tailored tuxedo, he simply offered his arm and stated, "You look the part." The drive to the exclusive underground dining club was tense. As they descended into the smoke-hazy Belvedere Room, Anthony leaned close. "The men at this table are capos. They view my sudden marriage as a sign of weakness. They will test you. Do not react. Keep your eyes down. I know how to handle awful people." Hazel stiffened. Dinner was a masterclass in psychological warfare. The men directed subtle, venomous barbs at Hazel, commenting on her origins and feigning shock when she didn't drink scotch. Anthony sat rigid, emanating a silent rage he couldn't openly act upon. But Hazel's eyes, trained by years of scanning chaotic diner floors, missed nothing. She noticed the man across from them, Marco, consistently checking a sweating waiter. When the waiter approached to pour wine, Hazel caught a tiny, imperceptible exchange. Marco slipped a note into the waiter's apron and palmed something metallic in return. As Marco subtly moved his hand beneath the table toward Anthony, Hazel didn't think. She reacted. "Oh my goodness," she gasped loudly. With a seemingly clumsy jerk of her elbow, she struck the waiter's tray. Just as he was lifting a crystal pitcher, the entire pitcher of freezing water cascaded into Marco's lap. Chaos erupted. Marco leaped up with a furious bellow, and as he did, whatever he had been holding clattered openly onto the hardwood floor. The table froze. Lying under the dim lights was a sleek, suppressed micro-pistol. Anthony slowly stood up, his eyes locked onto the weapon, then shifted to Marco, who had gone sickeningly pale. "It seems my wife's clumsiness has revealed a rather severe breach of dining etiquette," Anthony said, with deadly calm. "I am so terribly sorry," Hazel gasped, playing the flustered wife perfectly. Anthony grabbed her arm, his grip tight but no longer punishing. "We are leaving," he announced to the stunned capos. As they walked out, Anthony didn't speak, but his gaze had fundamentally changed. She was no longer just a ghost. She was a player on the board. The ride back to the estate was suffocatingly silent. The rain had started again, lashing violently against the tinted windows of the SUV. Hazel sat rigidly, the adrenaline from the dining club finally receding, leaving her limbs feeling like lead. She stared at the droplets racing across the glass, replaying the metallic clatter of the micro-pistol hitting the floor. She had just saved his life, or at least prevented a massive escalation. Yet Anthony hadn't said a single word. When they stepped into the grand foyer of the mansion, Anthony abruptly dismissed his security detail with a sharp wave of his hand. He turned to Hazel, his chest heaving slightly, the pristine facade of the Mafia boss cracking to reveal the raw, intense man beneath. "In my study. Now," he ordered, his voice echoing sharply in the cavernous space. Hazel's jaw tightened. The fear was there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was being rapidly eclipsed by a rising tide of exhausted anger. She had played her part. She had exceeded the terms of their twisted contract. She followed him down the long, shadowed corridor of the West Wing, the forbidden territory, her high heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood. Anthony's study was massive, lined with thousands of leather-bound books and smelling deeply of scotch and aged paper. He walked straight to a mahogany wet bar, pouring 2 fingers of amber liquid into a crystal glass. He drank it in one motion, then slammed the glass down, spinning to face her. "How did you know?" he demanded, his eyes locking onto hers with terrifying intensity. "Marco is one of the most seasoned operators in the northern sector. My own men, trained to spot threats, missed it. How did you know he was armed?" Hazel crossed her arms over her chest, suddenly intensely aware of the cold air against her bare shoulders. "I didn't know it was a gun. I just knew something was wrong. I spent 7 years waiting tables on the worst shifts in the worst part of the city. You learn to read people. You learn how a junkie twitches before they try to jump the counter. You learn the micro movements of someone trying to pull a fast one." Marco was sweating. He kept checking the waiter. They passed something. When Marco shifted his weight toward you beneath the table, I reacted. That's it. It wasn't some grand tactical genius, Anthony. It was survival instinct. Anthony stared at her, absorbing her words. The harsh lines of his face seemed to soften fractionally, replaced by a grudging, profound respect. "You intentionally spilled the water to flush him out." "I did what I had to do," she said, her voice dropping. "I don't want to see anyone die." He took a slow, deep breath, running a hand through his dark hair, ruining its perfect styling. "You saved my life tonight, Hazel. If he had drawn that weapon under the table, I wouldn't have had time to react. The optics of my death at a parley would have triggered a massive war." "You're welcome," she replied coolly, turning toward the door. "Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to take off this dress and forget this entire night ever happened." "Wait," Anthony said. The single word cracked like a whip, halting her in her tracks. He walked over to his massive desk, unlocking a lower drawer with a key from his pocket. He pulled out a thick, leather-bound ledger, its edges frayed with age. "You asked me, on the day we met, why your father's debt required such an extreme measure as marriage. You asked me what a mechanic could have possibly done." Hazel turned slowly, her heart beginning to pound a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "You said he saved your predecessor." "He did," Anthony said softly, his eyes darkening with shadows. "But not by accident, and not as a bystander." He placed the ledger on the desk and opened it to a marked page. "Come here, Hazel." Hesitantly, she approached the desk. She looked down at the aged paper, covered in a cramped, sharp handwriting. There were dates, amounts, and names, and there, halfway down the page, was her father's name, Arthur Collins. Next to it were entries for massive sums of money, followed by single-word descriptors. Driver, evac, cleanup, my father. "He wasn't just a mechanic," she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "Your father," Anthony said gently, his voice devoid of its usual cold edge, "was the finest getaway driver the syndicate ever employed. He was my father's most trusted asset on the street. 20 years ago, a rival family ambushed my father's convoy. Everyone was killed. Everyone except my father, because Arthur Collins drove a bullet-riddled sedan through a literal blockade of gunfire to pull him out. Your father took 3 bullets that night. It's what caused the heart condition that eventually killed him." Hazel staggered backward, hitting the edge of a leather armchair. The room spun wildly. Everything she knew, the poverty, the struggling garage, her father's sudden death, her mother's relentless financial stress, it was all built on a massive, bloody lie. "Why?" she choked out, tears finally breaking free, hot and angry down her cheeks. "If he made all this money, why did we live in poverty? Why did my mother have to work herself to the bone? Because after that night, my father offered him a choice, Anthony explained, taking a step toward her, his expression tight with a strange, dark empathy. Take the money and stay in the life, or walk away completely clean, with a new identity and a vow of eternal protection for his family. Your father chose you. He chose to be a poor mechanic so you wouldn't grow up with a target on your back. He sacrificed the wealth to give you a normal life. But the blood debt remained. When my father died, the rival faction saw an opportunity. They knew about the debt. If I hadn't married you, claiming you as my own blood, they would have used you to leverage me, or worse, killed you to send a message. Hazel sank into the armchair, burying her face in her hands. The revelation was tearing her apart. Her father was a criminal, a hero, a ghost. This entire time, she sobbed into her hands. I thought you were just a monster who bought me, but my life was already bought and paid for in blood. Anthony knelt in front of her chair. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a heavy, grounding force. We are both trapped by the sins and the debts of our fathers. Hazel, I inherited an empire built on violence. You inherited a debt built on sacrifice. I did not want this marriage any more than you did. But after tonight, after watching you handle Marco, he paused, his voice dropping to a gravelly, intense whisper. I realize you are not the fragile waitress I thought I was buying. You are your father's daughter. You have iron in your spine. Hazel looked up, her eyes red, meeting his dark, intense gaze. The cold, impenetrable Mafia boss was gone. In his place was a man burdened by an impossible crown, looking at her with a profound, undeniable connection. The cage doors hadn't opened, but suddenly, the space between them didn't feel so vast. On a suffocatingly humid Thursday, Anthony requested her presence to inspect a newly acquired maritime shipping facility, needing to present a unified, untouchable front. The massive warehouse was a gritty maze of corrugated steel and stacked shipping containers, a sharp contrast to the sterile estate. Deep inside the canyon of wooden crates, the atmosphere abruptly snapped. Down! Anthony roared, slamming into her and driving them both to the concrete, just as automatic gunfire erupted. The crates above them exploded into splinters. Anthony was a heavy shield, covering her completely before he drew his weapon to return fire at the shooters on the catwalks above. Pinned down and cut off from their security detail, the situation was dire. We can't stay here. They'll flank us, Anthony shouted over the deafening din. Hazel's mind, honed by years of managing chaotic diner crises, clicked into survival mode. Spotting a narrow gap between two steel containers that led to an access door, she grabbed a heavy chunk of broken wood. "I'll draw their fire!" she yelled. Before Anthony could stop her, she hurled the wood at a stack of metal barrels. The loud clang instantly drew the shooter's automatic fire. "Now! Go!" Hazel screamed. Anthony grabbed her hand, and they sprinted across the open concrete, bullets whining at their heels. They dove into the gap, bursting through the access door into a filthy alleyway, putting distance between them and the kill box. They finally collapsed behind a rusted delivery truck 2 blocks away. Hazel's lungs burned. A jagged piece of shrapnel had sliced her forearm, though the adrenaline masked the pain. Anthony leaned beside her, his chest heaving, a raw, breathless sound escaping his lips. "You drew fire from trained killers with a piece of scrap wood." Hazel let out a shaking breath. "I told you. I know how to handle awful people." Anthony stared at her, the walls of his Mafia boss persona entirely shattered. He took off his ruined suit jacket and gently wrapped it around her bleeding arm. "We need to get to a safe house," he murmured intimately. dialing his extraction team. As he stood guard over her in the alley, Hazel realized a terrifying truth. She was no longer afraid of him. She was afraid for him. The safe house was a stark contrast to the sprawling grandeur of the estate. Located on the top floor of a nondescript, brutalist apartment building in a working-class neighborhood, it was a purely functional space. No marble, no chandeliers, just reinforced steel doors, bulletproof glass, and minimalist, utilitarian furniture. It felt like a bunker because that was exactly what it was. Anthony locked the 5 heavy deadbolts on the front door, his movements sharp and rigid with residual adrenaline. The extraction had been a tense, high-speed evasion through the city's back channels, avoiding the main arteries entirely. The moment they were secured inside, the silence of the apartment felt heavy and suffocating. "Sit," Anthony commanded, pointing to a clean, white leather sofa in the center of the living room. He didn't wait for her to argue. He disappeared down a short hallway and returned a moment later, carrying a serious-looking, hard-shell medical kit. Hazel sat obediently, her body finally beginning to crash from the intense surge of fight-or-flight hormones. Her limbs felt like they were filled with wet sand, and the pain in her forearm, previously masked by adrenaline, was blossoming into a sharp, throbbing ache. She watched as Anthony placed the kit on the glass coffee table, snapping the latches open with practiced efficiency. He had discarded his ruined shirt somewhere in the hallway, leaving him in a fitted black undershirt that clung to the hard, muscular lines of his chest and shoulders. The dark ink of his tattoos' intricate, sprawling designs that spoke of violence and loyalty were fully visible now, stark against his pale skin. He knelt on the floor in front of her, the massive, terrifying Mafia boss reduced to a quiet, focused caretaker. "Give me your arm." Hazel hesitantly extended her arm. Anthony unwrapped his ruined suit jacket, revealing the bloody gash. He didn't flinch. His face was a mask of pure concentration as he poured an antiseptic wash over the wound. Hazel hissed, her entire body jerking backward, her breath hitching sharply. The burning sensation was absolute agony. "I know. I'm sorry." "Hold still," Anthony murmured, his voice incredibly low, softer than she had ever heard it. His large, calloused hand gripped her wrist firmly, holding her steady. He worked quickly, his movements precise and clinical. He threaded a curved needle and began to stitch the wound closed. Hazel turned her face away, staring fiercely at the blank wall opposite them, biting the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper to keep from crying out. "You did well today," Anthony said quietly, the sound of his voice drawing her attention back. He wasn't looking at her face. His eyes were focused entirely on the needle. Most veterans freeze under concentrated automatic fire. "You didn't just move. You thought tactically. You saved us both." Hazel let out a shaky breath, watching his strong fingers tie off the black thread. "I was terrified. I couldn't let us die in that dirty warehouse. Not after everything. Not after what my father did." Anthony paused, the needle hovering above her skin. He looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers. The distance between them was practically non-existent. She could feel the heat radiating from his skin, smell the sharp scent of the antiseptic mixed with his natural musky scent. "Your father would have been proud of you today, Hazel. You have his grit." The quiet sincerity in his words cracked the last remaining wall around her heart. A single tear slipped free, tracking through the dust on her cheek. Anthony reached up, his thumb brushing the tear away with surprising, startling gentleness. His touch lingered on her jawline, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheekbone. The air in the room suddenly shifted, growing thick and heavy. The danger of the day, the adrenaline, the forced intimacy of the medical care, it all coalesced into a highly charged, undeniable tension. Hazel found herself leaning into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut for a fraction of a second. When she opened them, Anthony was staring at her mouth, his own breathing suddenly shallow and uneven. He was a man who lived his entire life in control, suppressing his emotions beneath a layer of ice. But right now, kneeling on the floor of a safe house, he looked incredibly dangerously vulnerable. "Anthony," she whispered. A question and a plea tangled in his name. "Hazel," he replied, his voice a low, rough rasp. He leaned in, the distance closing until she could feel his breath on her lips. The sharp trill of the encrypted phone on the coffee table shattered the moment like a hammer hitting glass. Anthony jerked backward, his eyes snapping wide, instantly returning to the cold, calculating leader. He cursed softly in Italian, scrubbing a hand over his face before grabbing the phone. He stood up, turning his back to her, pressing the device to his ear. "Speak," he ordered, his voice back to its usual terrifying edge. Hazel watched the muscles in his back tense as he listened. She wrapped her good arm around her waist, suddenly feeling very cold. The magical, fragile bubble had burst, the brutal reality of their world crashing back down upon them. "Are you certain?" Anthony barked into the phone. "Understood. Secure the perimeter of the estate. Trust no one. I will handle this." He hung up, the phone clicking aggressively into its cradle. He turned back to Hazel, his expression grim and thunderous. The softness was entirely gone. "What is it?" Hazel asked, a knot of fresh dread forming in her stomach. "The ambush wasn't orchestrated by a rival family," Anthony said, his words falling like lead weights. "It was an inside job. Someone leaked our schedule. Someone high up in my own organization." "Who?" Anthony's jaw tightened, a lethal fury burning in his dark eyes. "My underboss, Vincent. He's the only other person who knew the exact timing of the inspection. He's making a play for the seat, and he used the vulnerability of having you there to execute it." Hazel stood up, ignoring the throbbing in her arm. "If he wants you dead, the safe house isn't safe. He knows about this place." "He does," Anthony agreed, walking toward a hidden wall panel and punching in a code, revealing a heavily stocked weapons cache. "But he expects us to hide here. He expects me to circle the wagons and wait for his next move. That is what a defensive leader would do." He began loading heavy, ominous-looking rifles, his movements a blur of lethal efficiency. He turned to her, tossing her a smaller, compact handgun. Hazel caught it clumsily with her good hand, its weight shocking her. "What are we doing?" she asked, staring at the weapon. "We are not going to wait," Anthony said, his eyes blazing with a cold, terrifying fire. "We are going back to the estate. We are going to walk right through the front door. He expects me to be weak. I am going to show him exactly why I am the boss." He looked at her, his expression turning grave. "But you cannot come with me, Hazel. I am sending you to another location, a secure site only I know about. It's too dangerous." Hazel gripped the cold steel of the gun. The old Hazel, the terrified waitress, would have run. But the woman standing in the safe house, the woman who had bled and fought alongside the devil himself, refused to be sidelined. She thought of her father, of the blood debt, of the way Anthony had looked at her moments before the phone rang. "No," Hazel said, her voice ringing out with absolute, unwavering certainty. Anthony stopped loading magazines, staring at her in genuine shock. "What did you say?" "I said no," Hazel repeated, stepping toward him, her chin held high. "I am your wife, Anthony, in name and in target. Vincent tried to kill me too today. If you go back there alone, you walk into a trap. But if we go back together, if the supposed weak link walks in beside you, covered in blood and unbowed, we strip him of his narrative. We show the syndicate that we cannot be broken." Anthony stared at her, the silence stretching long and heavy. He was searching her face, looking for hesitation, for fear. He found neither. He found iron, a slow, terrifying, and utterly magnificent smile spread across Anthony's face. It was the smile of a predator recognizing its mate. "You are insane," he murmured, his voice laced with profound awe. "I'm a waitress," Hazel corrected, clicking the safety off the handgun exactly as she had seen him do it in the warehouse. "I deal with the trash." The rain had escalated into a torrential downpour, turning the night into a howling, chaotic void as the armored SUV, driven by Anthony himself, tore through the winding approach to the estate. They had bypassed the main gates, using a hidden, unpaved service road that Anthony's father had installed decades ago. The vehicle slammed to a halt behind the massive stone carriage house, hidden from the view of the main surveillance cameras. The plan was simple, reckless, and entirely dependent on the element of surprise. Vincent believed them to be cowering in a safe house. He would be using this time to consolidate his power within the mansion, rallying the capos to his cause by spinning a narrative of Anthony's weakness and subsequent death. "Vincent will be in the West Wing." "The war room," Anthony said quietly, chambering around in his assault rifle. The sound was loud and final in the confined space of the vehicle. "He will have his personal guards at the doors. We enter through the servants' tunnels beneath the kitchen. You stay behind me. You do not engage unless fired upon. Understand?" Hazel nodded, her throat too dry to speak. She gripped the compact pistol in her right hand, her left arm throbbing relentlessly despite the tight bandage. They slipped out of the SUV into the freezing rain. Anthony moved like a shadow, leading her to an old, rusted iron grate, set flush into the foundation of the house. He hauled it open with a grunt of effort, revealing a dark, narrow stone staircase descending into the earth. The tunnels were damp, smelling of old earth and rot. They navigated the labyrinthine passages by the dim beam of a tactical flashlight. Hazel's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This wasn't a sudden, chaotic ambush. This was a deliberate, terrifying march into the lion's den. They emerged behind a hidden panel in the massive stainless steel commercial kitchen. The room was empty, the staff clearly dismissed. Anthony held up a hand, signaling for silence. He pressed his ear against the heavy swinging doors leading to the main corridor. 2 guards in the hallway. He mouthed, his eyes cold and focused. "Wait here." He didn't wait for her response. He pushed through the doors with explosive speed. Hazel heard the muffled thwip-thwip of his suppressed weapon, followed by the heavy thuds of 2 bodies hitting the plush carpet. "Leah," he whispered, pushing the door back open for her. They moved silently down the sprawling, opulent hallway. The mansion, usually so still, felt electric with tension. As they neared the heavy, double-oak doors of the war room, they could hear voices. Vincent's voice, booming and confident, carrying through the thick wood. Anthony's reliance on the girl was his undoing. He grew soft. The ambush at the docks confirms he did not survive the extraction. As underboss, protocol dictates I assume interim command. Until Anthony didn't hesitate. He didn't formulate a complicated tactical breach. He simply lifted his heavy, booted foot and kicked the center of the double doors with devastating, bone-shattering force. The oak doors violently exploded inward, tearing off their heavy brass hinges with a deafening crack, slamming against the interior walls. The scene inside froze instantly. Vincent, a sharp-featured man in a silver suit, stood at the head of a massive mahogany table. 4 other high-ranking capos were seated around him. A dozen heavily armed guards lined the perimeter of the room. Anthony stepped into the doorway, his assault rifle leveled directly at Vincent's chest. The storm raged outside the massive windows, lightning illuminating his furious, blood-spattered face. He looked like an avenging demon ripped straight from hell. "Rumors of my death," Anthony's voice boomed, carrying a terrifying absolute authority that vibrated in the chests of everyone in the room, "have been vastly exaggerated." A collective, stunned silence gripped the room. Vincent's face drained of all color, his arrogant posture crumbling instantly. His guards, caught entirely off guard, hesitated, their hands hovering over their weapons, unsure whether to draw on the recognized boss. And then Hazel stepped into the frame, standing shoulder to shoulder with Anthony. She was a shocking sight. The elegant midnight blue gown was torn and stained with dirt and dried blood. Her hair was a wild tangle. Her arm was heavily bandaged in Anthony's ruined suit jacket. But she stood tall, her chin raised defiantly, the compact pistol held steadily in her hand. She did not look like a cowering, terrified civilian. She looked like a survivor. She looked like a queen forged in fire. The psychological impact of her presence was immediate. The capos, men who valued strength above all else, stared at her in stunned reverence. Vincent's narrative of a soft boss, ruined by a weak girl, shattered instantly. "Vincent," Anthony said, his voice dropping to a lethal, vibrating growl as he walked slowly into the room, his weapon unyielding. "You orchestrated an ambush. You fired upon me, and you fired upon my wife." "Anthony, listen," Vincent stammered, raising his hands, his eyes darting frantically toward his paralyzed guards. "It was a mistake. I received bad intel." "You received the intel you created." Anthony cut him off ruthlessly. He didn't look at the guards. He knew he commanded the room by sheer force of will. He stopped 5 feet from Vincent. "You broke the sacred oath. You broke the trust of the family." "She's a waitress!" Vincent suddenly screamed, panic breaking his facade, pointing a shaking finger at Hazel. "She's nobody! You tied our legacy to trash." Before Anthony could react, Hazel moved. She didn't raise her gun. She didn't scream. She simply walked forward, stepping past Anthony's protective stance. Her eyes locked onto Vincent, with a cold, terrifying intensity that mirrored Anthony's own. Vincent, confused by her sudden movement, instinctively reached for the weapon at his waist. Hazel didn't hesitate. With a sudden, explosive burst of speed fueled by pure adrenaline and the heavy, solid weight of the silver tray sitting on the edge of the conference table, she grabbed the heavy metal platter and swung it with all her might. The heavy silver tray connected with the side of Vincent's head with a sickening, resonating crack. Vincent's eyes rolled back in his head. He crumpled to the floor instantly, unconscious before he even hit the expensive Persian rug. The room erupted. The guards finally drew their weapons, shouting, but Anthony was faster. He didn't fire. He simply roared, "Stand down!" The sheer, overwhelming command in his voice, coupled with the shocking, brutal image of his weak wife standing over the unconscious, bleeding underboss, broke the guards' resolve. They lowered their weapons, stepping back. The capos at the table remained perfectly still, their eyes wide with shock and newfound respect. Hazel stood over Vincent, her chest heaving, the silver tray clattering to the floor from her trembling fingers. She looked at Anthony. The fury in his eyes had vanished, replaced by an expression of profound, earth-shattering awe. "I think," Hazel breathed, her voice shaking but clear in the silent room, "that concludes the interim command." The immediate aftermath of Vincent's violent deposition was a masterclass in organized chaos. The mutiny, fragile to begin with and heavily reliant on the illusion of Anthony's death, collapsed entirely the moment Hazel struck the underboss down. The remaining capos, witnessing the sheer, terrifying unity of Anthony and his fiercely capable wife, rapidly swore their absolute, terrified fealty. Vincent and his immediate loyalists were dragged from the room, their fates unspoken but permanently sealed. Within an hour, the estate was locked down under the control of Anthony's fiercely loyal inner circle guards. The storm outside finally began to break, the torrential rain giving way to a steady, rhythmic drizzle. Hazel sat alone in the massive, silent expanse of the master suite's bathroom. The adrenaline had finally, completely drained from her system, leaving behind a bone-deep, shivering exhaustion. She sat on the edge of the marble bathtub, staring blankly at the ruined remnants of her blue silk gown, the fabric stiff with dried blood and dirt. Her hands shook so violently she could barely turn the gold fixtures of the sink. She had struck a man down. She had stood in a room full of killers and held her ground. The reality of what she had done, of the violent world she had fully stepped into, was crashing over her in overwhelming, terrifying waves. The heavy bathroom door creaked open softly. Anthony stepped inside. He had washed the blood and dirt from his face and changed into a clean, simple white shirt and dark trousers. But the weariness in his eyes was profound. He looked at her, his expression softening instantly at the sight of her shivering, traumatized frame. He didn't speak. He walked over to the bathtub and began turning the heavy brass knobs, adjusting the temperature until thick, warm steam began to fill the massive marble enclosure. He reached into a glass cabinet and poured a generous amount of expensive, soothing bath oils into the rushing water. Only then did he turn to her. "Let me help you," he said gently. Hazel didn't have the strength to refuse, nor did she want to. She felt completely raw, stripped down to her very soul. She stood up, her limbs trembling, with a heartbreakingly gentle touch, entirely at odds with the violent man she had witnessed in the war room. Anthony helped her peel away the ruined, stiff fabric of the gown. He didn't look at her with lust. He looked at her with a profound, aching reverence. He carefully unwrapped the bloody bandage from her arm, inspecting the stitches with a critical eye, nodding in satisfaction when he saw they held perfectly. He helped her step into the massive, sunken tub. The hot, scented water enveloped her, immediately easing the brutal ache in her muscles. Hazel sank down until the water reached her collarbones, closing her eyes and letting out a long, shuddering sigh. Anthony didn't leave. He rolled up his sleeves, pulled a plush stool to the edge of the tub, and sat down. He took a soft sponge, dipped it in the hot water, and gently, methodically began to wash the dirt and grime from her shoulders and back. The silence between them wasn't cold or tense anymore. It was heavy with unspoken words, with a shared, terrifying intimacy forged in violence and survival. "You terrified me tonight," Anthony finally spoke, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that echoed slightly against the marble walls. The sponge paused on her shoulder. "When you stepped past me toward Vincent, I have never felt fear like that in my entire life, Hazel. Not when the guns went off at the docks, not when I was staring down a room of armed traitors, only when I thought he might pull that trigger before I could stop him." Hazel opened her eyes, looking over her shoulder at him. The harsh, fluorescent lighting of the bathroom illuminated the raw vulnerability in his expression. "I couldn't just stand there and let him dismiss us," she whispered softly. "I couldn't let him win." Anthony's hand moved, his fingers tracing the line of her neck, his touch sending a warm shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the water. "You didn't just stop him. You broke the entire rebellion. The men in that room, they respect violence, yes, but they respect sheer, unwavering defiance more. You walked into their world, unarmed, and dominated it. They will never question your place beside me again." "But what is my place, Anthony?" Hazel asked. the question hanging heavy and fragile in the steam-filled air. She turned fully to face him, the water sloshing softly against the marble. "We survived tonight. Vincent is gone. Your power is secure. The blood debt my father owed. Surely it's paid now. I saved your life, you saved mine. The ledger is balanced." Anthony's hand dropped from her shoulder. He sat back on the stool, his dark eyes searching hers, a flicker of genuine panic crossing his stoic features. "Is that what you want? The ledger balanced? The contract voided?" "I don't know what I want," Hazel admitted, a single tear mixing with the bathwater on her cheek. 3 weeks ago, I was pouring cheap coffee and drowning in debt. Today, I survived an assassination attempt and assaulted a Mafia underboss. I am terrified of your world, Anthony. It's violent, it's brutal, and it's built on blood. Anthony looked down at his own hands, hands that had ordered deaths, hands that had pulled triggers. "It is," he agreed, his voice thick with self-loathing. "It is a dark, terrible world, and you are a light that has no business being dragged into it." He met her gaze again, his eyes burning with an intense, desperate fire. "But I also know that before you walked into that diner, I was a ghost haunting my own empire. I felt nothing. I cared for nothing except the survival of the organization. You brought me back to life, Hazel. You forced me to feel. You forced me to care." He leaned forward, bracing his hands on the edge of the marble tub, bringing his face inches from hers. "The ledger is balanced," he whispered fiercely. "The debt is paid. If you walk out of those gates tomorrow, you will have millions in your account. Your mother will be cared for forever, and my men will protect you from the shadows for the rest of your life. You are free to go." Hazel stared into his dark, tortured eyes. She saw the absolute truth in his words. He was giving her the ultimate choice. He was giving her the freedom he had initially stolen from her. She looked at this terrifying, powerful man who was currently sitting on a stool in a bathroom, looking at her as if she were the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. The fear of his world was still there, but it was eclipsed by a sudden, overwhelming realization. "If I leave," Hazel whispered, her voice trembling slightly, "who is going to watch your back?" Anthony's breath hitched. He stared at her, the desperate hope warring with the disbelief on his face. "Hazel." She reached a wet hand out of the water, placing it gently against his cheek, feeling the rough stubble along his jawline. "I hate your world, Anthony. But I don't hate you. I think I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Anthony closed his eyes, leaning heavily into her touch, a shuddering breath escaping his lips. When he opened his eyes, the icy Mafia boss was entirely gone. All that remained was a man deeply, undeniably in love. He leaned in, closing the remaining distance between them, and pressed his lips to hers. It wasn't a brutal or dominating kiss. It was desperate, gentle, and profoundly grounding, a silent promise forged in the quiet aftermath of a storm. The dawn broke over the estate not with a fiery sunrise, but with a quiet grey light that slowly chased the shadows from the manicured lawns. The mansion, having survived the violent purge of the night before, stood silent and imposing, but the atmosphere within its stone walls had fundamentally, irrevocably shifted. Hazel stood on the massive stone balcony of the master suite, wrapped in a thick plush robe. The cold morning air bit at her cheeks, but she barely felt it. She was looking out over the sprawling grounds, not feeling like a prisoner looking at her cage, but like a guardian surveying her territory. The exhaustion was still there, a heavy weight in her bones, but her mind was terrifyingly clear. She heard the soft click of the heavy glass doors opening behind her. Anthony stepped out onto the balcony. He was dressed in a dark suit again, ready to face the turbulent day ahead, dealing with the fallout of Vincent's betrayal. But his posture was different. The rigid, defensive tension that usually gripped his shoulders was gone. He looked lighter. He walked up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his solid chest. He rested his chin on the top of her head, sighing deeply as they looked out over the estate together. "The capos are assembling in the main hall," Anthony said quietly, his voice a comforting rumble against her back. "They want reassurance. They want to see the strength of the leadership. They want to know if they should be afraid of you." Hazel corrected softly. "They should always be afraid of me," Anthony replied, a hint of the old, cold edge returning to his voice. But then he tightened his grip on her slightly. "But they are more afraid of you right now. The story of the silver tray has already become legend among the gods." Hazel let out a small, tired laugh. "Great. I'm a waitress wielding a serving platter." Terrifying. Anthony turned her around in his arms, his expression turning serious. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. Hazel's breath hitched. A brief flash of memory taking her back to the diner, to the heavy envelope that had started this all. He withdrew a folded document. It wasn't thick like the marriage contract. It was a single page. He handed it to her. Hazel unfolded it slowly. It was a legal document, drawn up by the syndicate's highest lawyers. It was an annulment, already signed by Anthony. Attached to it was a bank transfer confirmation for an amount so large the zeros blurred together before her eyes. "What is this?" she asked, her voice tight. A sudden spike of panic piercing her chest. "I told you last night." "I know what you told me," Anthony interrupted gently, placing his hands over hers, covering the document. "But last night we were bleeding, exhausted, and running on adrenaline. This morning is reality. This document is your absolute freedom, Hazel. No strings, no debts, no shadows. You can walk away right now, and you will never see me again." Hazel stared at the paper. It was everything she had wanted 3 weeks ago. It was safety. It was normalcy. It was an escape from the violence and the fear. She looked up at Anthony. His face was a mask of careful neutrality, but she could see the profound, agonizing fear in his dark eyes. He was terrified she would take it. He was giving her the ultimate power over him. He was proving that she wasn't a hostage. She was a choice. Hazel looked back down at the document. She thought of the cold, lonely apartment she had left behind. She thought of the relentless, soul-crushing grind of the diner. But mostly, she thought of the man standing in front of her, a man who had shielded her with his own body in a hail of bullets, a man who had washed the blood from her skin with the gentleness of a saint, a man who desperately needed someone to pull him back from the abyss of his own power. Slowly, deliberately, Hazel gripped the top of the crisp legal paper. With a sharp, decisive motion, she tore the document cleanly in half. Anthony's breath hitched audibly. She placed the torn pieces together and tore them again, letting the fragments flutter from her hands, catching the morning breeze and scattering over the stone balcony like white petals. "I told you," Hazel said, stepping closer to him, wrapping her arms around his neck. "I deal with the trash. And right now, this empire needs cleaning up." Anthony let out a raw, shuddering breath, pulling her fiercely against him, burying his face in her hair. "You are going to drive me insane," he murmured, his voice choked with relief. "I'm going to keep you alive," she corrected, leaning back to look him in the eye. "But things are going to change, Anthony. The violence, the collateral damage. If I am staying, if I am truly your partner, we do this my way. We legitimize. We stop the bloodshed." Anthony looked at her, the fierce, uncompromising waitress who had brought an underworld empire to its knees without firing a single shot. He saw the iron in her spine, the compassion in her heart. and the sheer, terrifying intelligence in her eyes. "Whatever you want," the Mafia boss whispered, surrendering his entire world to the woman he had forced into his life. "You are the queen. I merely enforce the laws you write." He kissed her, a deep, passionate sealing of a new contract. Not one born of blood debts or forced obligations, but one forged in the fires of survival, respect, and an unbreakable, unexpected love. They turned back toward the glass doors, ready to face the wolves waiting in the hall below. But this time, the wolves wouldn't be looking at a boss and his captive wife. They would be looking at a king and the unstoppable force of nature that commanded him. The transition from a life of profound desperation to one of staggering power is never simple, and the scars of survival never truly fade. Yet, in the heart of darkness, Anthony and Hazel discovered a profound truth. True strength isn't measured by the violence one can inflict, but by the compassion one can maintain in the face of absolute power. The waitress didn't just survive the Mafia boss. She redefined him, proving that the most unbreakable bonds are often forged in the most unlikely fires. Love, it turns out, is the ultimate rebellion. If Hazel's incredible journey of grit and unexpected romance kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button. Share this story with anyone who loves a fierce, underestimated heroine. And don't forget to subscribe for more intense, dramatic stories. Your support means everything.